They arrived at Mass just after sunrise, 47 souls, each dressed in their Sunday best. They walked in. Not a single one walked out. The church was locked from the inside. The candles still flickered, but no one answered the knocking. Not even the priest, who was last seen preparing a sermon no one had ever heard before. The building is still there, empty, untouched, preserved like a shrine. And even now, the bells ring, but there's no one left to listen. It was a gray morning in late October, the kind of cold that settles in the bones before you feel it in the air. Entire Parish stood alone on the edge of the woodline, its stone bell tower rising like a finger pointed toward a sky that never quite cleared. The town of Ashfield Falls had known that church for over a century. It was quiet, humble, a sanctuary for generations of families who'd been baptized, wed, and buried under its slate roof. People said its pews still held the worn imprint of knees that had knelt for decades. The wooden doors, arched and iron-handled, had never once been locked during a service until that morning Mass was scheduled. For 9 o'clock a.m., 47 parishioners arrived, as they always did, on foot, by wagon, and now by car. They greeted each other with brief smiles, handshakes. Some carried Bibles, others just folded bulletins. No one noticed anything unusual. The air smelled of pine and frost at 9:03 a.m. The bells rang by 9:05. The last of the congregation had entered the church. A young boy, Thomas Alvey, was seen running across the road to catch up to his parents. That was the final witness. No one who entered came back out. The first onlooker noticed the stillness. It was 10 to 10 a.m. Mass usually ended by 9:50. The candles inside should have burned low. The side door should have opened, but everything remained still by 10:40. A neighbor, an older woman named Helen Crowder, walked up the gravel path and knocked. On the main doors, no answer. She pressed her ear to the thick oak wood. She said she heard the faint sound of breathing, but not one dozen's in perfect unison. Like a single inhalation stretched across many mouths, the local police arrived by noon. They attempted to force the doors open. They found them sealed, not locked, not bolted, but sealed. A carpenter was brought in by 3 o'clock p.m. He examined the hinges and said something strange. The doors had no resistance, no barrier. They should have opened, but they didn't. Be dusk. The sun cast the stained glass windows into sharp red and gold patterns across the surrounding grass. Inside, silhouettes could still be seen slumped, forms frozen in place. One near the front pew, another by the pulpit, but unmoving authorities made the decision to breach the church around 7 o'clock p.m. They used a battering ram. The doors gave way without resistance, collapsing inward as though they had been waiting, and what they found inside was nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no parishioners, no priest. The pews were intact hymnals left open to song. 141. A half-burned candle sat at the edge of the altar, and on the pulpit, a dark smear. Police initially suspected wine, then blood, but tests were inconclusive. It wasn't either. A forensic technician described the texture as oily, but dry. Another said it smelled like damp leaves. No one could agree on the color. Some said brown, others black with red undertones, like something that hadn't been alive in a long time. The organ had one key pressed down, middle C. It echoed softly when the wind came through the shattered upper pane. The priest, Father Marcos Alton, was never found. His quarters were untouched, his robes neatly folded, his Bible left open to Revelation 8. The townspeople waited for answers. None came that night. A small group gathered outside the church. They lit candles. They prayed. But one man, Edward Hall, a former deacon, stood silently, watching the steeple. When asked what he saw, he whispered, "There's still someone inside." The church was sealed again the next morning, by order of the diocese, not by law enforcement, not by court mandate, just a single handwritten notice nailed to the door. Sanctuary under internal review. 2 weeks later, the entire building was. Brick shut windows, boarded, bell rope cut, but the bells rang 3 times on Christmas Eve that year, and no one pulled the rope. Some say the congregation vanished. Others believe they were never there. But for those who had family inside that morning, who remember faces, names, voices, the grief never faded, only the world around it did, and still, St. Lareth's parish remains silent, untouched, and waiting. For what? No one dares to ask. The dust inside St. Lareth's always settled slower than it should have, even in sunlight. The air hung thick, full of weightless threads that never fell. And every morning for weeks before the disappearance, Father Marcos Alton was the first to disturb. I began arriving before sunrise, earlier than the groundskeeper, earlier than the altar boys. Sometimes earlier than the sun. He was seen pacing the nave with bare feet, muttering, a thick black journal clutched in one hand, pressed close to his chest like something warm. His lips moved constantly, but no one ever heard what he was saying at first. Town dismissed it. The priest had always been a little eccentric, quiet, severe, prone to long silences in the middle of his sermons. But what happened in October was different. Something had changed in his eyes. One parishioner remembered how, on the second Sunday of the month, he paused mid-homily, turned toward the empty balcony, and whispered, "They're listening now." After Mass, he rewrote the entire sermon, threw away the original in full view of the choir pages, ripped from his own notes, torn by hand, placed into a brass waste bin near the vestry door. By the third week, he was no longer writing anything down. He would stand at the pulpit and speak without reference. No Bible, no manuscript, only silence. And then speech witnesses say his tone shifted. Gone was the soft cadence of reflection. In its place, something rigid, measured, as if each word was being recited to him from a distance, and the words themselves were wrong. People couldn't remember what he said, only how it made them feel uneasy, ashamed, exposed. Mrs. Crawley, who had attended every sermon for 30 years, said she left the church early that Sunday, sat in her car for 30 minutes with the engine off, staring at the windshield. She couldn't remember the closing prayer, but she kept hearing the phrase, "Cover their mouths with faith." In the rectory, Father Marcos's journal was found after the disappearance. It was blank, every page empty except for indentations, dozens of pages bearing the faint pressure of heavy handwriting, as if they had been written and then erased or removed when held under angled light. Some of the words emerged faintly. One line appeared several times, always repeated in descending margins. "He says I must not let them speak. No one knows who he was." 2 days before the final Mass, the priest reportedly spoke to the janitor, Gerald Bennett. It was after hours. The church was empty. The lights had been dimmed. Gerald was mopping the aisle when Father Marcos emerged from the confessional, his collar unbuttoned, hands trembling. He leaned in and whispered, "They're not sins anymore, they're instructions." Gerald never returned to the church. When questioned by police later, he refused to give a statement, but he gave them one object, a small torn piece of paper, handed to him that same night. It was part of a sermon draft, the only surviving fragment. 6 words scrawled in uneven ink, and the voice said, "Seal the mouths." The rest was missing, torn cleanly at the edge. Linguists brought in by the diocese examined the phrasing. They noted that the voice is not a term commonly used in Catholic liturgy. It lacks authority. It implies presence without origin. One bishop suggested it resembled phrasing found in apocryphal texts, especially those redacted from early church canons. When asked which ones, he declined to answer, but something wasn't right. During an attempt to catalog past sermons from St. Lareth's, archivists discovered something strange. There were no recordings of October services, no audio, no video, no transcripts. Even the backup cassette player stored in the organ room, usually used by the choir director to record hymns, had been erased. Tapes labeled October 1st, October 8th, and October 15th were all blank. Each one contained exactly 33 minutes of silence, then a click like someone closing a book. On the following Sunday, the one where the congregation disappeared, no equipment was turned on. Nothing was recorded. The soundboard had been unplugged. The fuse to the audio system had been removed from the breaker. Panel by someone with keys, and still Father Marcos was seen entering the church that morning, carrying no notes, wearing full vestments. Mouth moving as he stepped across the threshold, a maintenance worker passing by claimed to hear a low murmur before the doors closed, a single, low, unbroken sound like chanting with no breaks for breath. He described it as distant but aimed directly at me. The last person to speak to Father Marcos was Sister Marianne, a former novice from the local convent. She visited the church 2 days prior to bring linens. She says she found him staring into the baptismal font. The water had gone still. He didn't turn when she entered. He just said, "When the word lives in water, the mouth must drown to let it speak." She left without saying goodbye. When investigators searched the pulpit after the disappearance, they found nothing written, only the torn paper placed gently between the pages of a closed hymnal. No ink on the surrounding pages, no fingerprints, just that single line. And the voice said, "Seal the mouths of the righteous." The handwriting did not match the priest's. The indentation on the page beneath it. To this day, no full draft of the sermon has ever been found. No backup, no record, only that sentence and the memory of those who heard something. They now refuse to describe. One man said it wasn't the words themselves, it was the feeling that they were being spoken into him, not from the pulpit, but from something lower, something beneath the floorboards. In every recollection, one detail remains constant. When Father Marcos finished speaking that final morning, he smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't belong to joy or peace, but to certainty, and nothing has been written since the grass near St. Hilareth's was overgrown by late afternoon. Tall blades bent beneath the wind, hissing softly as clouds passed. Overhead from a distance, the church looked like it was still holding its breath. No police tape, no news vans, just silence, and the tall figure of a woman standing beside the old cemetery gate, facing the bell tower. Her name was Eleanor Meyer. She had lived in Ashfield Falls her entire life. 92 years she had been deaf since birth. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, not shy, just attuned to a different frequency of the world. She was known for walking alone, always barefoot, even in the cold. She'd watch birds, count footsteps between houses, trace vibrations with her fingertips on glass. She never married, she never left, and on the day the congregation vanished, she was standing just 2 blocks away in her garden, tending to soil that had gone dry weeks earlier. It was just past 10 o'clock, a meal, when she felt I'd a low pulse, not like thunder, not like machine say, layered vibration that started in the soles of her feet and moved up through her ribs. She looked up toward the church. Doors were closed. The bell tower was still, but the sensation didn't fade. She stepped out into the street. No cars passed. The wind had stopped. Even the trees had stilled their rustle, and yet something moved. She described it as harmony without sound, like the ghost of music pressing against the bones. A rhythm without air, a melody she could feel later. She would call it singing, not from inside her head, but from above, from the eaves, the roofline, the spire-layered voices, voices that should have clashed in tone, but didn't, each holding to a note that didn't exist in any known scale, and the repetition over and over, 7 words, same phrasing, same measure. She couldn't hear it, not exactly, but she could read it in the movement of glass, in the faint trembling of fence rails, in the clink of spoons on tabletops inside her own kitchen. Left behind, she said she stood there for almost an hour. Then she walked toward the church, slowly, 1 step at a time, counting each vibration as she moved. Eleanor had always believed in God, but not in noise. When she reached the boundary wall, the sensation grew thicker, slower. The ground beneath her seemed to pull in the rhythm, like the hymn had taken root in the soil. Even the tombstones vibrated, and when she looked up through the stained glass windows, she swore she saw the figures inside moving, not people, not parishioners, but the painted saints. Those affixed to glass for decades were swaying, their mouths open, their hands lifted, singing. But something wasn't right. One of the figures, St. Agatha, usually depicted holding a palm branch, was now rendered mouthless. The gloss, where her lips should have been, had gone dark, painted over in a shade so deep it absorbed the sun. The others were facing away, not toward the pulpit, but toward the walls. As if listening, she stayed there until nightfall. She said the voices never stopped, not once, not even to breathe. By 7:00 p.m., when the police arrived to breach the doors, the sensation vanished, gone in an instant, like a curtain falling between her and the rest of the world. She turned back toward home, shaking when she opened the front door. She found something on her kitchen table, a hymnal old bound in cracked leather. It had not been there that morning. She didn't own one inside. Only a single page had been marked, pressed flat with a river stone. It contained no staff lines, no notes, just words, 7 of them. What mouths won't sing? The stone remembers. She burned the book that night. Neighbors reported the smell of myrrh in the air, but Eleanor had used nothing but matches and kindling. When questioned days later, she provided one more detail, one she hadn't shared before. When she'd stood beside the church wall, hand pressed to the stone, she had felt something tapping back, not in rhythm, not in Morse code, but insistently. She said it felt like fingernails, dragging, searching, trying to find the surface. Officials dismissed her account, called it grief, called it confusion. Some labeled her as opportunistic, but a specialist from the Archdiocese requested a transcript of her statement and made a single note in the margin. Check parallels with fragment from Caveat. Psalter, verse 39:7. That Psalter has since been locked in private Vatican storage. The verse is redacted. Eleanor never returned to the church. After that week, she no longer walked barefoot, no longer stood outside, but late at night, her neighbor claimed to hear her humming. Always the same rhythm, always in groups of 7 and once. In the winter of 1981, a young cousin who came to visit reported waking up at 3:00 a.m. He said Eleanor was standing at the window, mouthing something, silently, hands trembling against the glass. He asked what she was doing. She turned, smiled, and whispered, despite her deafness, "It's still singing." She died the following year, buried in the same cemetery beside. Est Ilerith. Her grave remains unmarked, but locals say if you press your ear to the ground just above it and stay perfectly still, you'll hear it again. Not a hymn, not a voice, but a feeling trying to make its way back into the world. Light filtered through the stained glass windows in fractured reds and greens. Dust drifted in beams that didn't flicker, and beneath the altar of St. Ilerith's, the silence was different. It didn't echo, it absorbed. 3 months after the disappearance, an independent historian was granted limited access to the site. His name was Andrew Kelmer, 52 years old, educated at C. Aloysius Seminary, no longer practicing. Come not for the mystery, but for the architecture. St. Ilerith's was one of the last pre-colonial chapels still standing in this part of the state. Gothic lines, hand-carved capitals, and an altar slab believed to have been imported. No record showed from where he was escorted inside under tight restriction. No photographs, no soil removal, only observational notes. He brought with him a leather-bound sketchbook, a penlight, and a floor plan dated 1891. He stayed for 4 hours, returned once more, and then never again. But in that brief window, he found something, and it began with a step at precisely 11:17 a.m. While walking around the altar dais, Kellner stepped onto a portion of stone that sounded different, not hollow, but softened, like stone pressed too many times in the same place. He knelt, ran his hand over the surface. The stone, there was darker, cooler, worn, smooth, but uneven. He removed a small brush and gently cleared the film of dust. That's when he saw them indentations, shallow, symmetrical, human-sized kneeling impressions. Not chiseled, not etched, but compressed as if something had pressed itself into the stone with a slow, deliberate weight. There were 12, in a semicircle, all facing the underside of the altar. At the center, one deeper than the rest, more than an indentation, a depression, like something had shifted its weight, again and again. Over years, he made a note, measured the depth with his pencil, Half-an-inch stone doesn't wear like that. Not from knees, not from time, not from prayer, but something had been there. Pressed down, listened, and then moved. Kelmer remained quiet for several minutes. He described the feeling as held breath. The room felt smaller, not darker, but closer. He turned his head and noticed something else. The altar stone itself had hairline cracks near the base, barely visible, running not outward but downward, as if something underneath had shifted recently. Pressed upward, but nothing had broken through. Not yet. At 12:06 p.m., Kelmer made a decision. He lifted the altar cloth, folded it back with deliberate care. Beneath it, a single Latin inscription, carved into the front lip of the stone, Audiens in loco suo. He translated it later, listening in its place, but it didn't make sense. No biblical reference matched. No papal decree. No liturgical index. He checked twice, 3 times. It was as if the phrase had been added by someone. Unofficial, and yet the carving was old, too old stone, worn at the edges, moss lining the inner letters. Not recent, not new. At 12:13 p.m., he reported hearing something. Not speech, not movement, a kind of weight, a momentary increase in pressure, like when a storm is about to break. A heaviness centered beneath him. He stepped back, felt the floor beneath his shoes suddenly shift. Not enough to make noise, but just enough to suggest space air. There was something hollow below the altar. He returned to the 1891 floor plan, checked it, cross-checked it. The altar stood over solid earth. No crawl space, no crypt, no foundation cavity, no reason for hollowness, and yet there. It was not a room, not a tunnel, but a gap. He tapped his penlight against the floor. Once the sound was dull, like soil under tension. Then a second tap. This time, something knocked back, but not where he tapped. A few feet to the right. 3 sharp knocks, precise spaced. Kelmer dropped his notebook. He stood frozen. There were no animals inside, no air conditioning, no roots beneath this part of the structure, only solid ground and stone. And that's when he heard a scraping, slow, deliberate metal on rock, like something dragging a nail, not to escape, but to trace to map. He didn't wait. He packed his bag, left the altar cloth folded, took the sketch of the kneeling marks, left everything else. He drove to the diocesan office that same evening, filed an informal report, labeled it acoustic anomaly under high altar. They never responded. 2 weeks later, Kelmer stopped speaking publicly about St. Hilareth's. A colleague who visited him months later said he'd removed every religious object from his home, even the cross above his mother's old mirror. When asked why, he said, "I don't think it's ours anymore." He died in 2006, natural causes. But his daughter later found his original notes hidden in a hollowed-out hymnal on the last page. In block letters, he'd written something strange. Kneeling is not submission, it's listening. And below that, smaller. They didn't pray, they waited. The floor beneath the altar has never been excavated, but ground-penetrating scans, done unofficially in 1989, show voids unshaped, irregular, like pockets of collapse. One researcher described them as a negative of presence, not a structure, but an imprint of something that had been there for a very, very long time and may still be listening, waiting. The diocesan archives sit beneath St. Auster's Cathedral in Charleston. 5 floors below street level, thick concrete walls. No windows, just long corridors of file cabinets and the hum of fluorescence that never quite stop flickering. It's the kind of silence you don't notice at first. Then you feel it pressing inward. In 1996, a junior archivist named Daniel Frewer was assigned to catalog unprocessed correspondence from the early 1970s. He had no reason to expect anything unusual, just handwritten letters, clergy transfer requests, retired priests sending birthday cards, the usual forgotten paper trail of a church that had stopped reading its own mail decades ago. But in Box 12B, tucked between 2 dusty seminary applications, he found something: a single envelope, no return address, no date, only one word written in small block letters across the front. Urgent. The letter inside was unsigned, typed not on diocesan stationery, not on any known typewriter template. It began without greeting. This is not an accusation, it is a warning. Frewer read the entire page twice, then a third time. He didn't understand the letter referred to a priest by name Father Marcos Alton, the pastor of St. Hilaret's parish, but the tone was not that of complaint, nor concern. It was desperation. The writer described behavior that hadn't been publicly acknowledged, that hadn't been archived in any official record. Not yet, they claimed. The priest had begun holding private confessions at night, unscheduled, unrecorded day, said the lights in the church would remain on long past midnight, but no penitent ever entered only. Father Marcos alone. He would speak not from the booth, from the altar, not to the people, but to something else. The letter went on to mention a phrase one that would come up again in later investigations. The sermon not meant for ears that hope to stay sane. The writer begged the diocese to intervene, to reassign the priest, to send someone, anyone. There were no allegations, no doctrine violations. Just this: if you hear what he hears, you will be lost. Frewer photocopied the letter, flagged it for further review, brought it to his supervisor the next day, but the file was gone. Not the copy. The original box 12B was still there, still labeled, still full, but the letter had vanished. No record existed in the index, no catalog number, no date stamp, just the copy. He returned to the archives that night. Alone wanted to read it again, get the wording right, but the photocopy had changed. The margins were narrower, the lines retyped, phrase about the sermon gone in its place. The truth is not for preservation, it is for silence. He tried to show it to others, but each time someone else looked. They said it was blank, a clean white page, no ink, no markings, just faint impressions, as if someone had typed a message, then erased. I've kept the page anyway, filed it in a separate folder, labeled it Hilareth Correspondence, never entered it into the system. Years later, a priest involved in the diocesan legal board confirmed something strange. In late 1972, the bishop received a private call from a parishioner in Ashfield Falls. The caller begged him to intervene at St. Hilareth's, claimed the priest was reciting sermons that made people ill, headaches, shaking, temporary speechlessness. The bishop dismissed it. No official record was made, no visit was scheduled, but in a handwritten margin of his appointment calendar scribbled beneath the week of October 9th, he had written, Alton hearing things again, which suggests it wasn't the first. Tima, retired clergy secretary, later confirmed that Father Marcos had once been placed on brief sabbatical during seminary. He'd begun talking in his sleep, and Latin none of his instructors could verify where he'd learned the dialect. It wasn't liturgical. It was pre-Roman, older than Scripture, more aligned with fragments from the underground catacombs, inscriptions carved into early martyr tombs. But the seminary covered it quietly, sent him away for spiritual retreat, brought him back. 6 months later, sober, polite, quiet until St. Hilareth's, in that letter. To this day, no one knows who wrote it. The typeface couldn't be matched. Asterisk. The paper was standard issue. Even the folds were flat, like it had never been mailed. Just placed. One theory suggests it was written from inside the church by someone who had begun to hear the same sermon, but hadn't yet forgotten how to be afraid. Frewer eventually left the church. He kept the copy of the letter in a private folder for years, showed it once to a seminarian friend. Friend would later recount what he saw. The letter was blank, but it made his nose bleed. He described it as ringing behind the eyes, a pressure like someone pushing 2 fingers gently into the back of his skull. Frewer died in 2004, undisclosed illness, no obituaries, only a short note filed with the archives. Do not open correspondence from Hilareth without second reader present. The copy of the letter was never found, but its final line was transcribed in one journal entry written in pencil, half faded. It read, "If the sermon must be heard, seal the ears of the innocent, or bury the voice beneath the altar before it's too late." No action was taken, no one came, and by the time they did, there was no one left to hear. The air outside St. Hilareth's was colder than expected that morning, March 12, 1974. Just past 8 o'clock a.m., the sun was up, but its warmth hadn't touched the ground. The grass remained brittle. Frost clung to the chapel windows, like breath that had frozen in place. A black sedan arrived from the East Road, unmarked, no insignia. The man who stepped out wore a plain cassock and narrow wireframe glasses, tall, mid-60s, thin, to the point of concern. He was introduced as Father Aurelio Balthus, Jesuit, assigned directly by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, but internally, among those who spoke of such things in code in sideways glances, he had another title, Investigator Ecclesiae, Custodian of Spiritual Faults. He never used the word exorcist, but others did. He had arrived with no entourage, no briefcase, only a leather-bound copy of the Latin Vulgate, edges worn corners, softened from years of thumbing. He did not ask for a tour. He did not ask for coffee. He walked the perimeter of the chapel alone, silently, one hand pressed into his side as if warding off a dull pain or something else. He stopped at the north wall, rested his fingertips against the stone, closed his eyes. Witnesses reported that he stood like that for nearly 4 minutes, breathing shallow, body motionless. Then he opened his eyes, vomited, no warning, no stumble, just a sudden convulsion onto the grass beside the wall. He wiped his mouth, said nothing, and walked toward the main entrance. The door had been left ajar, still sealed with police tape, though by then no one was guarding it. Father Balthus paused at the threshold, not in fear, not in hesitation, but in something else. Recognition. He did not step forward. He didn't even place his foot over the stone lip. He simply looked and then turned. He removed a small notepad from his coat, wrote 6 words in dark ink. The liturgy has been reversed. Then, below it, the sanctuary is no longer his. He tore the page, handed it to the diocesan representative, and walked back to the car. The entire visit had lasted less than 20 minutes. He said nothing else. When questioned days later, he declined to speak on record, but privately, he met with the Archbishop of Charleston. An aide to the Archbishop later described the exchange. Father Balthus reportedly stated that the pattern was identical. When asked to what, he didn't answer, only said, "It started again, not from the ground, but from the mouth." And then he requested dispensation from his duties. Effective immediately, he never returned to the church. No funeral was ever held, but something wasn't right in the months after his visit. Church officials made quiet inquiries. Private Coded 1 memorandum asked, "Is there precedence for a sanctuary remaining spatially intact while liturgically inverted?" Another, "Is the Mass capable of drawing down rather than lifting up?" These were not rhetorical questions. They were directed to theologians trained in forbidden texts, ones rarely discussed outside sealed rooms. Replies were cautious, vague. One document, later unsealed under the diocesan error review policy, included a chilling observation. The inversion of sanctity does not require desecration. It requires attention, which implies something had been listening, not in violence, but in liturgical alignment. Like a mirror, the altar, the hymns, the sermon, all remained structurally intact, but they no longer pointed upward. Report filed from the Jesuit Curia in Rome included a list of sites of historical resonance. All were churches, all had been sealed, all had reports of unusual sound phenomena, mirrored liturgy, and what they called voice repetition dislocated from origin, and all had been erased from public registry, except one. St. Ilareth. Father Balthus's final note was discovered years later, tucked into the back of his Vulgate. The page was handwritten, unlabeled. It said, "We did not teach them to worship backward. We taught them to listen in the wrong direction." No one has been able to explain what that means, but when the Vulgate was examined, another detail was found. The ribbon bookmark was pressed between Psalm 74 and Psalm 7:5. Specifically, it marked a verse that reads, "They break down all the carved work thereof at once, with axes and hammers. They have cast fire into thy sanctuary. They have defiled by casting down the dwelling place of thy name to the ground." When asked if Father Balthus had recommended demolition of the church, The response from Rome was non-committal, but an unofficial note appended to the file read, "Structural. Damage is not necessary. The reversal is architectural only in metaphor. It lives in attention, in repetition, in acceptance." The door to St. Hilareth's has since been sealed shut, welded, barred, but the steps leading up to it remain clear of debris. No leaves collect there. No vines grow as if something is waiting, still holding its place, still inverted, still holy, just not for us. Rectory behind St. Hilareth's still smelled of wax and mildew. Even decades later, the floorboards never stopped creaking, and the walls, painted over a dozen times, never held warmth. In April of 1983, a diocesan maintenance team was sent to inventory the building's remaining possessions, no longer for preservation, just for legal closure. The church wanted the file closed. They cataloged old vestments, dusty ledgers, a collection of rosaries curled like sleeping insects inside a tin box. Then they found the tape, a 7-inch reel, unmarked, found behind a bookshelf in the study, wrapped in a linen cloth, tied with twine, no label, no documentation. It shouldn't have meant anything, but the man who found it, Peter Albridge, then 27, said he felt heat radiating from it. The cloth was cool, the metal beneath strangely warmy. He didn't report it, just logged it as unlabeled AV reel, stored it in a padded box, took it to the diocesan archive for testing 2 weeks later. A technician named Janice Lau cued it onto a reel-to-reel machine in the old media lab. It was nearly silent. The tape crackled lightly, normal magnetic hiss. No voices, no music, no indication it had been used until 11 minutes and 34 seconds. It started without warning. Not a voice at first, but pressurized low frequency. Sound barely audible, but it registered physically. She described it as a drop in the stomach, like standing on the edge of something tall. Before the wind reminds you that you're too close, then came the voice, but something wasn't right. It wasn't Father Marcos. It wasn't any known accent. It wasn't even human in rhythm. It lagged behind the tape, like it had entered sideways, spoken. Syllables were out of time with the recording head, a delay, impossible to explain with analog media, and every person who heard it heard something different. Janice Lowe heard a man whispering prayers in reverse, verses she didn't recognize, but the cadence was familiar, like lullabies sung at wakes. She stopped the tape, left the room, vomited in the hallway. She later said, "He was praying for me to forget him, and I did." Peter Albridge heard something else, not a prayer, not a voice. He said it felt like his own thoughts being narrated back to him, only 1 second delayed, but louder and wrong, as if the voice inside his head had learned how to pronounce his secrets. Said, "It wasn't telling me anything. It was listening, and I was speaking without my mouth." They played it one more time. This time, in front of a visiting bishop from Springfield, name withheld. He insisted on hearing it, sat calmly in a soundproof booth, monitored through a glass window. At 11:34, he blinked, then froze. 20 seconds and his mouth opened, but no words came out. He began to weep, silently, no sobbing, just tears. At 11:58, he stood, tore off the headphones, and struck the glass with both palms. He didn't stop until they opened the door. He never said what he heard, never returned to Springfield. He entered a private order 6 months later, took a vow of silence, still living, as of the last known record, but not speaking, not writing. Only one note was recovered from him, scrawled on a napkin during a rare evaluation. Asterisk. The words do not belong to language. They belong to hearing, a church. Linguist analyzed the waveform of the audio at 11:34, described the voice pattern as non-linear, cyclic, and cross-modulated with its own silence, which, in simpler terms, means it was speaking through the quiet. The tape was not officially destroyed, but when requested in 1991 for forensic replication, it could not be located. Its storage box remained. The inventory slip still inside, but the reel itself missing. Room where it was last played has since been sealed, but the machine used to play it still exists, stored in the sub-basement archive, marked retired equipment, "Do not reactivate" on the spooling plate. In faint permanent marker, someone wrote a time code, 1134, and beneath it, in almost imperceptible cursive, it wasn't recorded, it was waiting. There are no known copies, no backups, but the diocese has since issued a quiet order. Do not play unlabeled reels from Elerith without formal approval and post-auditory psych eval. Unofficially, a memo circulated internally. If you hear something you recognize, stop the tape. If you hear something recognize, you run. No one who's heard the tape has ever agreed on what it said, but all of them remember one word spoken differently. Each time heard in different tongues yet unmistakably the same. Come, spoken not as invitation, but as instruction, as inevitability. No one plays tapes from St. Elerith anymore, because the last time it spoke, someone answered back it was a small, church rural old stone walls, softened by ivy, the kind of place where everybody knows everyone, and no one locks their doors. And on October 14th, 1972, the parish of St. Elerith gathered for the 9 a.m. Mass. It was a routine service. Ordinary time, Father Marcos presiding, no feast day, no special visitors. But in the weeks following the incident, after, the police found the pews empty and the chapel sealed from the inside. A diocesan team began compiling a list of every parishioner known to be inside. The ledger was simple, a handwritten roll from the back of the sacristy. 32 names families, elderly widows, 1 seminarian on break from studies, and 6 names no one recognized. Not a single townsperson could identify them. No record of residence, no baptismal certificates, no marriage logs, no death notices. But something wasn't right. The names were listed in the same ink, same hand, same flow, no corrections, no hesitation, which means whoever wrote them believed they belonged in. Investigators began cross-referencing local census data. Every household in Ashfield Falls, every adjacent town, nothing. Surnames didn't match any known family in the region, not even distantly. And then came the photograph. A deacon named Gerald Huntley had snapped a photo 10 minutes before Mass began, a wide shot of the sanctuary congregants, seated, smiling. He was testing a new camera, Kodak Retina Reflex Fresh Film Clear exposure. The photo was later developed by the state police, but when returned, it showed something strange. 6 of the figures were blurred, not motion blur, not exposure error. The rest of the image was sharp. Even the dust on the pews was visible, but the faces of 6 individuals had no detail, just ovals of smudged light, as if the film had been wiped in those precise places. Even stranger, those 6 figures were seated far apart, not a family, not a group, not speaking to anyone, each positioned alone. And when the photo was digitally scanned decades later, it produced a different effect. The blurred faces weren't just obscured, they were absent pixels in those areas, red as null data color, without form, structure, without image. It was as if those parts of the image had never existed at all. One technician noted that the values in those regions didn't follow compression logic. They weren't noise, they were holes. And in one of the printed versions, under infrared light, a faint pattern emerged across the chest of one of the blurred figures. Not a shirt, not jewelry, a sigil, circular hand-carved lines, almost like an inverted cross, but incomplete, curved at the bottom, interlocked with something. Serpentini, retired theologian from Marquette, examined it, said it resembled certain forbiddens, marginalia art found in early monastic texts that had been censored by the 4th century. Wrote only, the visitor motif unconfirmed, proceed. With caution, local historians reviewed attendance records going back 3 years. No match for any of the 6 names. No donation logs, no confessions, nothing. Yet their names appeared in the priest's own hand on the morning ledger as if they had always been there. And one more thing of the 6 names. One was listed as child unknown. No first name, no surname, just a dash. And the word child, there had been no record of an infant baptism that month. No visiting families with young children. But in the photo, between the blurred figures, A small shape can be seen in the third pew, just low enough to be seated, too low to be seen directly. But there is a shadow, one that doesn't match the light source. It stretches forward against the angle of the sun, and though no face is visible, something else is the hymn book in the pew ahead. Open pages fluttered not by wind, not by movement, but as if turned one by one. In rhythm, as if being followed, the pages stop on number 241. That number doesn't correspond to any known hymn in the 1972 liturgical catalog, but the page title, faintly readable through digital enhancement, says, "Song for the One Who Listens Back." That page is not in any modern hymnal, nor archived in diocesan record. No parishioner remembers singing it, but in the corner margin, someone had written, "He is among them now." There is no known origin for that note, no matching pen, no fingerprints. When asked to confirm the identities of the 6 blurred figures, all surviving townspeople gave the same response: "I don't remember them, but I remember knowing them." Which makes the next discovery worse. In 1999, a researcher compiling the oral histories of Ashfield Falls found an anomaly in 3 separate interviews. When asked about St. Hilareth's, each speaker paused at the same point. Each one mentioned sitting next to a stranger that morning, and each one said something nearly identical. They were kind, but they didn't blink. There were no strangers in town, no visitors recorded, no vehicle logs, only names written by hand on a list that never changed, and the photo, even now, refuses to stay still, because over the years, the blur has spread from 6 faces to 7, and no one knows who the 7th was, or who the next will be. Road leading to St. Hilareth's is gravel now, overgrown, faded signage. You could drive past it a dozen times and never notice, but the building still stands unaffected, like it remembers something the rest of the town has worked very hard to forget. It's been over 50 years, and the stone facade has not darkened. No moss has grown on the roof. The wood in the doorframe hasn't splintered. Not even the hinges have rusted, and it's not just weather resistance, it's suspension, as if the moment the doors were sealed, time itself was asked to wait outside. But something wasn't right. In the winter of 1996, a preservationist from Charleston working on a survey of pre-war churches visited the site. She arrived just after sunrise, brought with her a camera, a notebook, and a full toolkit for environmental sampling. What she found disturbed her. The interior temperature was exactly 71 degrees. No variance, no humidity, dust levels below standard thresholds. She noted that the votive candles near the altar still had wicks, not burned down, not melted unlit, but never used. Altar linen was still folded clean, crisp. At the corners, she took samples from the air ducts, the stone foundation, and the window caulking, all returned with results that confused the lab. The samples were chemically unremarkable, unaged, as if they had been removed from their context. One report used a term not typically applied to buildings: arrested organic stasis. And yet, the real questions didn't begin until the children started talking. Over the years, local kids, most often on dares, would sneak up to the chapel after dark. They weren't breaking in. The door had long since been sealed, but the stained glass was accessible, especially from the western tree line. And it was always the same story. They would peer through the colored panes, lightless from within, and see shapes, not movement, not flickers, just silhouettes, frozen, kneeling heads bowed in prayer. Unmoving, unchanging, their reports were consistent: 8 to 12 figures, some seated, some standing, but most kneeling in rows, all facing forward toward the altar. One boy claimed he saw a hand raised as if caught mid-blessing, but when he blinked, it was gone. Another girl said the glass warmed when she touched it, only where the figures were, not around them, just directly over their shapes, as if the heat had come from behind the image. Multiple children without knowledge of each other's stories described the same detail: a figure near the back of the nave, turned slightly toward the window face, indistinct, but with something in the mouth, not a tongue, not teeth, but fabric, like a strip of cloth tied between the lips, binding them shut. And then, none of the children ever saw the figures move, not once. Asterisk. Not even a twitch, but they all said the same thing afterward. They were listening. No adult ever corroborated the sightings, but none of them ever went to the window either. They didn't need to. They remembered the preservationist never returned, filed no formal report, but in her private correspondence discovered after her death, she left a note scrawled in the margin of a notebook page. The air inside the nave wasn't still. It was held like breath not yet exhaled, later thermal. Scans taken by a university research team revealed another anomaly the building, when photographed at night with long exposure, showed no interior heat signatures, except a faint band of warmth running horizontally through the main sanctuary, exactly where the pews were. Warmth wasn't from residual sunlight. It matched human body temperature consistently across all benches, but there had been no entry in decades, and when checked again 3 weeks later, the band remained identical with identical placement, like something had simply never left the lead researcher. Described it as a thermal memory. But that theory was dropped when one final scan taken at random during a thunderstorm revealed a different pattern. The figures were now standing one by one, in gradual sequence, from back to front, not all at once, not instantly, but with the slow certainty of something ancient and unfinished. The research team destroyed the image, said it was a data corruption, but one assistant made a copy and posted it anonymously to an archived theology forum in 2007. The thread was deleted within 2 hours, but not before one user replied, "That's the 9th station, but they're facing the wrong way." St. Hilareth's has since been placed under ecclesiastical quarantine. The grounds are fenced, the windows boarded, but still no signs of decay, no graffiti, no broken glass, as if the world outside simply doesn't recognize it anymore. Those who live nearby report something stranger still on certain mornings. Before sunrise, they say the birds stop singing, the dogs won't approach the fencing. Most unsettling, the old chapel bell can be heard faintly, as if rung by a hand that does not move, always one tone, always 3 times, and always before the sun has touched the stones, as if announcing a mass that no one attends, but continues all the same, inside a building that refuses to change. Because something inside refuses to leave, the grass along the eastern wall of St. Hilareth's grows taller than anywhere else. Thick, unnaturally soft. Children say it smells like candle wax and warm bread. Even though no one has opened the doors in 50 years, the stone is cold to the touch, but at night, it listens back. There's no official record of the first report. Only stories passed through families, spoken quietly or not at all, but it's always the same detail. If you press your ear to the southern wall, the one with the arched window facing the cemetery, you'll hear it not sound exactly, not voice. Something between a hum, a mutter, a sermon whispered, but not in English, not Latin, not anything. And still, you understand it, but something wasn't right. In 1997, a group of university students from the nearby seminary conducted an informal experiment. They brought a directional microphone, taped a contact sensor to the stone, ran it through noise filters, at first static, then pulses, soft, regular, too structured, for natural vibration, and then it began. A pattern emerged, not words, but cadence rising and falling like breath. The structure of a homily: call, response, pause, repeat. At minute 9, the lead student, Anthony Veras, began to cry. No stimulus, no memory. He just dropped to his knees on the grass and wept. Sighed later, it felt like hearing your own funeral read aloud, but with forgiveness. Another member of the group, Bethan Riles, wrote afterward, "It wasn't what the voice said, it was what it knew when it said it." The recording was saved, labeled, filed, but when they returned to review it days later, the tape was blank, not erased, not damaged, never recorded. The machine had captured silence, but they remembered what they heard, and each one described it differently. Anthony said it was about mercy. Bethan said it was about correction. A third member refused to speak about it. He left the seminary 3 months later, disappeared entirely the following year, and yet others kept going. Amateur ghost hunters, former parishioners, a handful of curious journalists. Most heard nothing. but some did, always between 3 o'clock and 3:12 a.m. Never before, never after fade, lean in touch the stone and freeze. One woman said it felt like her own mouth had gone dry, but her throat kept moving. Another said she didn't hear anything at all, but tasted wine and ash. None of it made sense, but all of it matched. There were patterns. A man from Ving, Michigan described it as a morning chant for things not yet lost. A teenager wrote in a blog post that it sounded like a lullaby, sung in a voice that didn't care if you slept. A retired nurse claimed it named every mistake she'd made since age 6, but in a tone so gentle, she couldn't help but forgive herself. Then came the incident. A technician working for the diocese hired to do ground scans for sinkholes reported hearing nothing through the wall, but afterward, his ears wouldn't stop ringing. He described it not as tinnitus, but as the edge of something trying not to be heard. A week later, he left a message on his supervisor's machine at 2:41 a.m. He simply said, "I understand now it's not talking to us. It's talking through us, and we're not listening. We're echoing the call." Disconnected. He was found 2 days later at a rest stop off I-90, alive, unharmed, but unresponsive. Hasn't spoken since. And then came the child, 9 years old, lived on a farm down the road. No history of religious education. No exposure to the chapel. His parents reported him waking up 3 nights in a row at exactly 3:11 a.m., speaking in his sleep, whispering. They recorded him the 3rd night, posted the audio online as a curiosity. An old priest heard it, recognized the structure, not the words, but the tone, the flow. He played it backwards, slowed it down. It was a benediction, half complete, missing a response. One side of a dialogue, waiting for someone to speak back, and that's when he heard it in. The background of the child's whispering, layered beneath, was another voice, lower, not louder, but deeper, saying one word over and over: remain, as if pleading, as if instructing, as if cursing. No one knows what the voice is. No one knows who speaks it, but the walls of St. Hilareth still hold it, not in air, not in vibration, in stone. Some believe it's residual energy, a memory, a trauma loop. Others think it's something worse, a homily that was never finished, a sermon designed not for hearing, but for inhabiting. And the longer it goes on, the more it knows. What you fear, what you regret, what you would undo if you could. It does not judge, it does not forgive, it reminds. Today, people still visit the chapel, not in daylight, not for prayer. They lean in, eyes shut, ear to the stone, and they listen. Sometimes they smile, sometimes they scream, but always they cry, because no matter the language, they understand, and it understands them. The voice doesn't need words. It never did, because it was never meant to be spoken, only heard. What is a sermon, if not a covenant between speaker and listener? But what happens when the speaker is no longer human, and the listeners no longer exist? Faith, like sound, needs air to travel, but some sermons move through silence. Some prayers were never meant to be heard by us. Next time, we return to the other side of the pulpit, where the choir never stops singing.